Democracies can fail. Current events have raised the question of how stable or fragile democratic structures are, and whether democracy is much more vulnerable than we think. The Weimar Republic, the first democracy in Germany, ended with the rise to power of the Nazis in 1933. What happened back then? What parallels are there to the situation today? And why was the Weimar Republic so significant for the arts?
It was a springtime of hope. People were high on hopes for the future and even wanted to be a role model for the world. They wanted to show that Germany was capable of creating a liberal and social political order in equal measure.
It was the start of a new era in Germany, but there were many enemies of the young democracy. The Weimar Republic was a period in German history from 1918 to 1933. How were the principles of its democracy, such as the separation of powers and freedom of expression, overturned? To understand that, let's first take a look at what was going on back then. Let's go back to the year 1918. Germany, an empire ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II, lay broken after 4 brutal years of war, one that it had irrevocably lost. A revolution gripped the country, and the Kaiser was deposed. Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed the first democracy on German soil.
Das Alte und Morsche, die Monarchie ist zusammengebrochen. Es lebe das Neue, es lebe die Deutsche Republik.
A newly elected National Assembly retreated to Weimar to avoid the almost civil war-like conditions in Berlin. There, it drew up the Weimar Constitution, the draft for a democratic society that, for the first time, enshrined women's suffrage and freedom of expression. But there were many enemies of the young democracy. Some wanted the monarchy back, others hoped for communism. And then, of course, there was the NSDAP, the National Socialist or Nazi Party, which was founded in 1920. But it wasn't just the young democracy's opponents that brought about its downfall.
It was a political experiment, and the reasons it didn't succeed are many. One of them was that the basic conditions were not particularly favorable. This first German democracy had to bear the burden of the lost World War.
World War I had left Germany with immense debt, as well as an obligation to pay substantial reparations to other countries. Hyperinflation and high unemployment were the result. The population suffered, and the country could not find stability. But at the same time, the 1920s were also a dance on the volcano's edge, full of experimentation and freedom-seeking. It seemed everything was allowed: topless bars, frivolity, a Babylon, a creative, lustful debauch that remains unparalleled today.
When we think of Weimar today, we think of some of the great artists that were, modern artists that were active in Berlin. We think of the new kinds of musical experimentation, Brecht and Weil. We think of the sexual experimentation, the extensive gay rights movement, all of that was going on that we sort of, think of. It gets very much portrayed in media, in popular entertainment, like recently Babylon Berlin.
It is precisely that contradictory era that provides a welcome backdrop for one of the most successful and expensive streaming series ever produced in Germany, Babylon Berlin. The crime story is an international success, having been sold in 140 countries. The 5th season is currently in production in Berlin.
There was a tremendous surge of modernization in art, in painting, theater, music, but also in politics, in the way society defined itself as far as minorities were concerned. When we look at that today, we see that an incredible number of topics that concern us now were actually invented back then.
sagen wir mal, erfunden wurden, ja.
The Bauhaus movement revolutionized architecture and design with clean lines and a focus on functionality. Representatives of an art style called Neue Sachlichkeit, or New Objectivity, such as Otto Dix and George Gross, depicted the harsh realities of the times in their paintings, often with a strong dose of biting social commentary. And in the movies, with expressionist masterpieces like the now classic silent films Metropolis and Nosferatu, Germany became the Hollywood of Europe. And once the currency stabilized in 1923, people partied like there was no tomorrow, especially in Berlin.
But this pulsating life in Berlin, which was the most exciting city in the world, is a phenomenon that is limited to a small segment of society that can afford it. This blatant contradiction between sophisticated international life in Berlin, shining Berlin, and the dreary existence in the tenements can be felt everywhere.
When the stock market crashed on Wall Street in the US in 1929, the fallout hit Germany especially hard.
The completely misguided policy in reaction to it, namely an austerity policy, destroyed the democracy. It shook people's confidence that they could create a better life for their children, or that politics would solve their problems.
That made an already unstable democracy even more fragile. This means, yes, a democracy is also dependent on ensuring economic prosperity.
Are there similarities to today? Possibly. People are uncertain. The coronavirus pandemic and geopolitical conflicts have weakened economies, while technical innovations and digitalization are changing the labor market. Wealth is still accumulating in the hands of only a few.
We started developing the series 10 years ago, and had no idea then how much events, political and social conditions would become more and more like those of the Weimar period. Somehow, even worldwide, you could say.
A lack of money was a reason for the failure of democracy in Germany, but it wasn't the only one. Many who were skeptical of the new democracy longed for the Kaiser, blaming democracy and not the consequences of the war for the economic instability.
The sworn enemies have clearly stated that they reject democracy, that they want to establish a dictatorship, that they want to establish a political system that's not based on competitive elections, not on freedom of opinion, and not on political plurality.
Societies always react like pendulums. There's a swing to the left, and then there's a swing to the right. On the one hand, there were hundreds of queer clubs in Berlin. An Institute for Sexual Sciences was founded. At the same time, of course, all the old elites, especially the men, felt that was all overreaching and that they had to turn back the clock.
The more complicated times become, the more people look for simple answers. Let's look at how that was exploited by the Nazis. Because that was one of the strengths of the Nazis, promising simple solutions to all problems.
Simple answers were, in fact, the political core of Hitler's election campaign appearances. Hitler could never have held his own on a talk show, where he would have had to present his economic program.
Hitler's goal was a homogenous Germany that would set itself apart from the rest of the world, and take a nationalist stance internally, with a clear scapegoat for all problems: the Jews. Hitler presented himself as a simple solution to all pressing problems. He pledged to end unemployment and offered retribution to a humiliated people. He acted as an authoritarian father, promising to make everything all right again. And the German people followed him.
I think we need to be alert to the fact that unless we think we're a different species than the people of the 1920s and 30s, and I'm pretty sure we're not, that there's no reason we would not be subject to the same outcomes if we are confronted with the same causes.
We've talked about the points that caused democracy to teeter, but how exactly did the Weimar Republic come to an end? As sophisticated as the Constitution of the Weimar Republic was, it had loopholes that could be used to undermine the system. First and foremost, Article 48, which gave the Reich president the power to override basic rights by means of emergency decrees and to make decisions on his own. In 1933, the Reich president appointed Hitler as Reich Chancellor, and just 6 weeks later, the Enabling Act was passed. From then on, Hitler acted without a parliament. Democracy was history. That could no longer happen under the current German constitution.
Germany has found a clever institutional design. Its institutions are arranged in such a way that we do not have one part that can take on a life of its own at the expense of other democratic institutions.
So lessons have been learned from the failure of the Weimar Republic. But isn't there a saying, history repeats itself?
Yeah, there's a couple of versions of that thought. I actually like the one that is attributed to Mark Twain, which is, history does not repeat, but it rhymes. And I think there's a real insight there. I think what we're seeing right now is kind of rhyming history more than repeating history. There are certainly many differences between the 1930s and now in any country, in all countries. The most obvious key difference is we've seen this movie before.
Protecting democracy requires everyone to get involved. History shows us that democracy cannot be taken for granted, even if it's felt like that for a long time.
All of us have a duty to be involved. Don't let politics be someone else's thing. Or I have enough faith in us as humans and in our democracy to think that if we are involved as citizens, the outcomes are generally going to be better.
Democracies need protective mechanisms and people who are engaged, forever vigilant and vocal in their defense of democracy.